So the recent strike action in the country has spurred on discussions about whether South Africa's labour laws are easily manipulated to benefit unions and in the long run costing jobs, or are they constitutionally sound and absolutely necessary for the well-being of workers? Let's talk about this with Osborne Molatudi, MD and Employment and Labour Law Specialist at Molatudi Attorneys. Osborne, a very good afternoon to you. Good to speak to you again. Is there merit to the argument that the country's labour laws, especially around strikes, give an unfair advantage to workers, or is that just capitalist speak?
I would say it's an unfortunate comment or observation, and good afternoon to you and your viewers, Tembegile. The reason why I say this is because the South African Constitution recognizes the right to strike as an important bargaining tool for trade unions. And in terms of that provision, which is also endorsed in the LRA, a trade union can call on its members to embark on a strike subject to certain procedural requirements being complied with. By the same token, employers do have a right to lock out striking employees and also subject to certain procedural requirements being complied with. So it is an unfortunate observation. And, one will have to really look at what the Constitution and the LRA say about the right to strike and the right to lock out.
Let's just talk about the processes a bit more, because there is sometimes a public perception that by the time we see workers striking, that it was an overnight action, but there is quite a road that the employer and unions have to travel before they get there, no?
Indeed, it's quite a road, for both parties to travel. Firstly, the union must set out the list of its demands, submit them to the employer, and the employer to respond likewise. And thereafter, the parties may request a facilitator, in most instances the CCMA, to facilitate the discussion, the wage negotiations, and in the event of a deadlock, then the facilitator, and in most instances the CCMA, will then issue a certificate entitling the trade union to call on its members to go on a protected strike within 48 hours. If the employer is the state, the notice must be given to the state, must be given 7 days notice. And those are procedural requirements. The same applies to the employer. It must identify the employees that are to be excluded from its workplace. It must make a demand to say, this is what we put forward. If you don't accept it, you'll not be allowed to enter our workplace, subject, of course, to picketing rules that the striking employees will have to follow. And those picketing rules are also subject to negotiations between the parties. But by the time they get there, everything has been regulated. The parties would know that if there's going to be a strike, there are picketing rules in place, etc. I think what is unfortunate, Tembegile, is the fact that some strikes can tend to be violent. And I think that's what members of the public would most certainly be concerned about.
But that also cannot be divorced by South Africa's very violent reality, because so many other situations often in this country are resolved or addressed through violence.
It was unfortunate that in many episodes, when you see, violent strikes, one of strike employees will say no, it's because that's the language they understand. This is very unfortunate. And that is why there is a call on employers to seriously look into the demands that are put forward by the unions. Of course, some demands may be unrealistic, especially where trade unions are demanding double-digit increases at the time when the economy is trying to recover itself from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. But be that as it may, I think there has to be an element of seriousness, if not one does not want to mention the word maturity, in approaching wage negotiations for the sake of preserving, the already vulnerable economy that our country is facing, as well as making sure that life and property continues to be protected.
On that note, then, negotiating in good faith. Often we hear a lot of that from either side, and unions accuse accuse the employer of going into negotiations with a predetermined position and not willing to budge. The employer also says the same thing about labor, and I wonder how effective then the processes before a strike actually are if everyone comes in so committed to a position that they're often not willing to budge.
I think the processes are effective. That is why in some instances you will find some affected employers applying for interdict in the event that any of the requirements or the elements of a protracted strike are not adhered to. There's violation of some of the rights to property, life, you name it, and that is why most in an interdict will be a strike will be interdicted. I mean, just to give you an example, an unprotected strike that is not in compliance with the provisions of an LRA loses any protection whatsoever in terms of the provisions of the LRA. And the affected trade union and or their members even run the risk of being sued for damages as it was, laid down by principles emanating from case law. So the procedures are effective. Either party has the remedy if it believes that the other party is not complying with the laws of this country, insofar as the right to strike and the right to lock out striking employees.
Osborne Molatudi, good to have your time as always. Thank you.